we established that, there's much about what's happened in this moment and our history that we acknowledge is real and true, but where our frustration, I think many others, and where we see the source of like conflict and tension in this moment is that there's a narrative that's being presented to us, and it's being drilled in us. This is the problem. This is the problem. This is the problem. Like you were saying with Morgan Freeman and what he was talking about, which I haven't seen that, but it's, as we've suggested, we've come from this ugly past, and we have been in a process of healing, and maybe that's going slower, much slower than it ought to, but we're making progress. And in people's everyday lives, a lot of people don't experience these extreme forms of racism and prejudice. There might be very real forms of it, but they're more subtle and underneath, and that's not okay. But most people have, meaningful and healthy relationships that are interracial, and we're all moving forward, and we feel like we're making progress. And then all of a sudden something like this happens, and we're just bombarded with, this is the most serious problem facing humanity, and we must do something now. And unless we accept these solutions, then you must be racist and you must be part of the problem. And that's where everybody's like, whoa, hang on a minute. And because the solutions aren't just simply don't be racist and, punish the cop and do these certain things.
We need a Green New Deal.
Yeah, it's all these extra things added onto it, and all these agendas that are attached to these groups that mobilize for it, that we don't agree with those things.
We need to destroy the nuclear family.
Yeah, we don't, and even the way that we're being told that this is protests and peaceful demonstrations, and there is the vast majority of the people gathering probably are simply there for that. Though they're very impassioned and outraged at these events, they weren't planning to go and smash a window and steal a computer. So there's a minority of people in these big groups of people that are creating and instigating and are part of all this chaos. And maybe from there, then more people get sucked into it in the moment. And a lot of people's outlook on life, it doesn't really keep them from participating in the, in the madness. But most people really aren't agreeing that this is part of the solution.
Right.
And so that's what we want to get at. Particularly, there's just certain things that are being presented as part of the solution, almost a mandatory part of the solution that really don't have to do with racism. Mm-hmm. Or maybe they've connected it in some way to the overall system of injustice and oppression that they say exists, that really becomes more maybe economic and other factors, but and you could talk about those things and attempt to address them, but there's really more. This is all more ideological driven than the actual circumstance.
So 2 things off what you just said. The first thing I wanted to say, I didn't want to cut you off, but I want to say this quick, is it's so interesting to me that we, in our individual lives, desire for our loved ones and our family and our friends to be patient with us on our journey as we grow as a human being. We do not want them to treat us like we were when we were 14, now that we're 21, and that we want them to be patient until we become 28 and 29 and 30, and as we grow in maturity, because we're trying to grow. Babe, I'm trying to grow. Mom, Dad, I'm trying to grow. Friends, I'm trying to grow. Like, be patient with me. But if our friends start throwing rocks at us and go, nope, I'm done being patient, kill them. Like, how would we respond? Like, how would we respond to those friends? Well, we'd go, well, I'm not being friends with you anymore because you won't be patient with me. Like, I'm walking away from you, or we would walk away from our spouse if they never were able to be patient with us. So it's interesting to me that it doesn't help the process moving forward for my growth, right? If I'm coming out of something, I need your patience. I need time, and I need your love, and I have an issue.
You have to speak truth in love to that person as the one who cares about them.
Yes.
To encourage the growth. But not condemn them.
And it amazes me that we come to a nation which is full of those people, and we go, nope, I demand it right now. I'm not being patient anymore. I'm like, guys, if you think that's going to work, you're about to take 10 steps forwards and 50 steps back. Because if anybody did to you what you're doing to the nation in your own personal life, you would get rid of them. You wouldn't walk with them anymore. Right? And so that's what I see happening is we're so unwilling to look at this from what if this was happening to me in my personal life? Now, if I wasn't moving anywhere, if I was sitting still and I wasn't progressing, I would expect my mom and dad to come up and be like, hey, this ain't gonna work. Or my wife to be like, hey, look, you've been the same for 3 years. Like, you can't keep doing this. Like, I would expect that. But if I'm moving forward, my wife's not going to come to me and go, like, crush me.
And you might not want to hear it, and you might get defensive.
I might get defensive.
You might push back.
I would. It ain't my mind. I would get defensive and push back.
It's inherent, but you would recognize the real need and, humble yourself before it. And that's where, white Americans can do that and are willing to do that. I think we see a willingness among people to engage in this conversation and want to change and want to create a better world for their friends and neighbors and our future generations.
Yes.
Like, we want that desperately.
I'm here for my son. Like, I'm doing this with you for my son.
Yeah. But the rhetoric, and it's understandable that you would get some of this, but because the rhetoric is given a much louder voice through the media and then driven through the media, the rhetoric is inherently divisive.
Yeah.
And there are some who are like, well, so what? We're already divided. We already have these problems. So I don't care if it makes you mad. And okay. But let's just consider where this will lead and what effect is it already creating. So when you start using the language that's inherently divisive and start placing the blame, quick to place the blame without recognizing your own flaws, without being humble in that way and saying, hey, I got a part to play in this too. How can we engage it? Because that's a mature thing to do.
Yeah.
That's what adults do. That's what a very mature adult can do, is engage a problem proactively. Most adults aren't even that mature and good at communicating. So we all do this, like you said, all do it all the time in our personal lives. So now it's playing out in mass, but it's being fueled and antagonized by
your friends. It's like, man, hey, she ain't even waiting on, man, she ain't being patient with you, get rid of her. And then on her end, it's, hey, listen, he is a loser. You need to get rid of him. Don't wait on him no more. You got these gossiping friends in your marriage trying to feed the fuel to the point that divorce is happening. Because you're listening to all these outside voices and now you're fighting more and there's more war, and maybe he hits, I would never hit my wife. That's just not, but maybe he hits the woman and then the woman spits at the man and then divorce happens and then boom, marriage is ended and kids are just extremely harmed. The kids are harmed. Now the next generation is going to struggle because they had to see this divorce, they had to feel this divorce, and it's painful. And now you went backwards. You haven't went forwards. And I'm glad you started the marriage analogy because it's so good to use, because that's what's happening. So in the things that we don't affirm, I'm just going to go ahead and say this one. Black lives are being systematically targeted by the police for their demise. And the reason I structured it that way is because that's what's on the Black Lives Matter website. That Black lives are being systematically targeted by the police for their demise. And as me and Dustin are trying to say, the police is the key term there. The police. We're not saying that Black lives have not been systematically targeted. We absolutely affirm that. And that's what this podcast is really about. We affirm that they've been systematically targeted. The only question is, by whom?
Yeah, and you could even say there have been police departments, blocks of the justice system and things like that throughout history that have practiced an unfair treatment of Black people. We're not saying that hadn't existed systematically in the system, but it's these absolute statements, these very broad generalities that are made that then
Defund the police.
isolate, separate, and create division that, when then the police as a whole becomes the counter target, then you're automatically putting people at odds with one another, because in reality, the police is made up of all kinds of people at different levels of, society and government, from local to national, and from mall security guards to UN peacekeepers. You got, and this is millions and millions of people we're talking about. Men
of
and
all
women,
color,
black and
all
white,
gender.
Hispanic, all kinds of people here. So just such a broad statement.
But there's
is
a fall guy.
not helpful. It's not helpful. And it's not true.
Right.
It's not true statement to say it like that. But it's easier to say it like that.
Way easier.
And if you're
It doesn't
looking,
take any work. It doesn't take any
Right.
work. You don't have to be diligent in your work to discover what is true like that. That is a very simple, simplistic statement that just allows me to go, okay, I'll go act on that.
and it fuels passions as
Yeah.
well. And what's real common in a lot of these protests and demonstrations, and in some of these organizations, they're appealing to those emotions, and they're trying to rally people around their cause. And so it's easier to do that and appeal to the emotions when you don't really engage the mind so much. You just say, hey, look at this piece of evidence. This is how you ought to feel about it, because this is what it means. Hey, come with me, and let's do this, because this is really the problem.
Yeah, and so you see this in all crime movies, right? You see this in all mob movies. You see this in a lot of movies. There's a fall guy. There's always a fall guy, right? And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to take the fall guy and we're trying to redirect who's putting it on the fall guy, right? We're trying to redirect the passion, redirect the anger, not the looting and the rioting, but redirect the anger to the correct group that we ought to be angry at, that we ought to be passionate towards. And what we would find is if we would do that, then this would not be so much a color issue. This would be a class issue, right? It would be way more class oriented than it would be color oriented. And that's what they don't want. They don't want you to see the reality behind that.
And even there, that can lend itself, because a lot of people
They could use that
They would
too.
agree.
Yeah, they could use
that's
that too.
part of
Yeah.
it, and then be quick to jump on that bandwagon and make it all about class, make it all about economic issues. But if you're just simply evaluating kind of the numbers of it, looking at really trying to get the real issue, then you quickly discover that class, economic status, and all these things have to do with the problem, perhaps to a much greater extent.
Yeah.
And in the conversation, the solution can't be gotten at without addressing those kind of concerns as well, and what that means for whether it's economic opportunity, education opportunities, your upward mobility in society, even the other things that sort of suppress the lower economic statuses more, whether that's drug use, whether that's relational issues in the home, or whatever it is, and I would just simply say there are other factors that are big, important factors that have to be part of the conversation. Not that, any one of these others is the real boogeyman here, but just, hey, if we're having a conversation, then we need to have the conversation.
Yeah. So you've mentioned two other things that we affirm. I'm just going to say them so we can get them on the mic. We don't affirm that today's system is the same as the Jim Crow system. Like, we don't affirm that. And that's being pushed, right? That's being pushed out there, that nothing's changed. We've already talked about that. We don't have to talk about it. I just wanted to get it out there so we kind of say the things we affirm. And then also, you just affirmed another thing, that we believe that systematic racism, systematic corruption among the police, these things are not the highest priority in the Black community. Like, these would not fall number one and number two in terms of how can we help our Black brothers And again, this is a year 3 conversation in your marriage, right? Like you can't have this conversation in the first year, but these are not 1 and 2. And that's what the narrative is. The narrative is that these are 1 and 2, that nothing's changed. We're back in Jim Crow days, that the police are systematically racist, that white people are systematically racist, that white privilege is running white supremacy is running rampant. It's growing. It's on the rise. If we don't do something about it, they're going to kill us all. Like we have to stomp it out. And so they're taking our focus and putting it on the things that aren't the main issues so that we don't look at the things that are the main issues. And that's what you were trying to say. There's so many other factors that are so much more dangerous to the Black community than these factors, right? And it, for one, is the nuclear family, fathers in the home, right? It's education. It's the way the education system's set up. It's Black on Black crime. And I know right now there's somebody on the end of this going, oh, but these things matter too. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it's just odd to me that we're not protesting these things. Like, where are these signs at? Where are the signs of fathers in the home? And this is becoming to plague the white community too. I'm not just talking about the Black community. Like, fathers in the home is a American issue. It's not a Black community issue. It's a human issue, right? Black on Black crime in Chicago, like a lot of prominent Black people are coming out right now and saying, like, why do Black lives not matter there? Like, why are we not talking about that? Like, Black on Black crime is rampant in the United States. The education system, why are we not protesting that? Like, why are we just protesting white supremacy and racism, inherent systematic racism? Like, why are we only protesting that? Like, that's interesting. Right? And that's what you're trying, as we grow closer. And what are the other factors surrounding it, right? Why does this all of a sudden come up right as we get close to a election? Why did it come up 4 years ago, right as we got close to an election? Did it just go away the last 3 years? Did it just go away the 3 years prior to that year? Like, if we don't start to see this, like, this is becoming such a theme, like, that we ought to go, like, the first year I get it. Okay, it's hard to see. But this is a theme now. Like, patterns and themes ought to be recognized. We ought to be able to sit back and go, hold up, what's going on here? Like, it can't go away for 3 years and then come back up inside of this year just because it's an election year, right? And it's like, that ought to piss Black people off, because now you're starting to see they're using you. Like, they are playing you. They are playing your emotions. They're playing all the things that you're talking about that we ought to be dealing with. They are playing you. Yeah. And they're showing their cards that they don't give a damn about you. Forgive my speech, but they don't give a damn about you. They just want to use you. And we ought to see that. Yeah. Like, if you don't vote Black, if you don't vote Democrat, you ain't Black. Who said that? Did Trump say it? No. He didn't say that. Was Biden, right? Like, but that wasn't a big deal, man, because he's blue. He's in the blue team, whatever, red, blue team, whatever all that team stuff is. I don't know. I'm not a team. I didn't vote in the last election. Ooh, that might surprise you, right? I didn't vote for anybody because I couldn't figure it out. You know what I mean? Like,
well, and you've said a couple of times now, you've referenced a they, and they are doing this or that.
That's the next podcast. Stay tuned, because we're going to talk about they next. But I know Dustin's about to get into it because he's going to.
Well, and I'd just say, before going into the they, on the point you were just making, just a chance to see, because what we're saying is what we don't agree with. And what we don't accept is that police brutality and racial injustice in the system is the most pressing issue for Black Americans. It's not to say it's not an important one, that it's not high up there, that you shouldn't care about it. But as far as the seriousness of it, the consequences, the threat to the most number of people, we're just simply saying that, or asking the question, but we know the answer is not that it's number one. There are these other things that have a more detrimental impact that need to be worked on and pushed forward. And so people are quick to then. But what happens is when others, and in particular white people, are quick to point out some of those things, fatherlessness, Black on Black crime, then then often we're doing that from a place, we're frustrated about the situation, but we're also being accused in the process, or police in general, and you're trying to defend the police.
That's where you don't care about any of this because you don't.
And so just simply to point out those other factors is an important part of the conversation that we need to have. But in the moment, people are defensive, and so they feel like when you're pushing back with those things that you're not listening to their grievance here in the moment. And so there's a reality to that. Not being quick to push back with your counterpoints, but just hearing them out. But if you're going to have a constructive conversation, and if you're really going to get at the root of the problems for your people and in your community, then you have to look at the things. And if you're really serious about addressing the issues that plague your community, then you have to look at these things and treat them with integrity and not be hypocritical, because that's kind of the main counterpoint is like, hey, don't be hypocritical. We're simply trying to point out that these other things seem to be more prominent and pressing, and perhaps even, they affect each other. So, hey, let's talk about these things too and try to address them and not just demonize this group of people, but they perceive the pushback is like, oh, you're just trying to push back on us and demonize us. And what the Black community would often say is so many of these issues are related, and the inherent bias and injustices along the way have caused and created and perpetuated the fatherlessness, lessness, because they're caught up in the criminal justice system. They're in jail over crimes that shouldn't have such severe punishment, or culturally, or because of the education system, they hadn't had the opportunities, and so young Black men end up out on the streets, which ends that they end up in jail, and then they can't be fathers, and then that cycle perpetuates itself generation after generation. That's real. That's real, okay? And all these things are related to one another. So let's talk about them all.
Right.
And let's not get defensive.
Yeah, amen. And if you really care about the Black community, you will talk about them all. Like you will. Like that's what we're trying to say. Like if you care about a movement, if you care about something different other than the Black community, and you're more just wanting to use the Black community, then you're going to elevate this and push the passion and the emotion while pushing it. Like, when is the last time I've heard a news anchor, I won't even, on any of them, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, any of them, I don't care, talk about fatherlessness, talk about education in the Black community, talk about these things. When have you heard it? I haven't. It don't exist anymore. And the reason is because that don't fit the narrative. It doesn't.
And it doesn't get ratings.
And it doesn't get ratings.
And it requires conversation.
It does require
long-form conversation more that's not about quick talking points and making political jabs.
That's right.
But
if you do a quick thought experiment and you just took these things, racism, police brutality, fatherlessness, education, and Black on Black crime. And if you just think about it, if you elevate these things and you deal with fatherlessness first, and you deal with education first, it will directly affect these things, right? It will directly affect these things. It will. If you deal with these things, it will affect the police brutality side, because you won't be in the kind of situation where it could even happen, right? You won't be in, it will affect. Now, I'm not saying that it's solely your fault for this. It's not what I'm trying to say. Somebody will take that out of context. But my point is, if you focus on these things, on education, on fatherlessness, I promise you these things will fix itself. And that's not me saying that. That's Denzel Washington. That's Denzel Washington specifically saying that. You know what I'm saying? If you work on these things will work themselves out in the system, right? And so I think that's important, like just being able to see that, and that's what the picture we're going to paint in the next podcast. Being able to see this for what it really is so important. It's so important, because if you get caught up in this tunnel vision view, I get people going crazy if you believe the garbage that they put in front of you. I get it, man. I get your anger. I get the division. I get everything that's happening. But it's because this, and it's because we're not looking at the big picture and going, hold up. Like, something else is going on here. Like, this is not what we think it is. But we are caught up like hamsters in a wheel, looking like just stuck in our wheel, just running like they tell us to run, instead of getting out of the wheel and going, whoa, something else is up here.
What's really going on?
What's really going on? So that's what we're passionate about, and that's what we're going to move into next week. Is we want to start to help. There's a passage in the Bible, and this is what I was telling Dustin this the other day. It's when they're talking about David's mighty men, and they're talking about all these, like a list of all these people of the division of the armed troops who were in David's his main corps, right? His military, his people, and it's listing out all these men of valor, these strong men and spearmen, and just like all these mighty men, right? And then all of a sudden, it's something very unique. It gets onto the half tribe of Manasseh, right? And it says, who were expressly named to come and make David king. Of Issachar, men who, understanding the times, knew what Israel ought to do. And I just found it interesting because it's talking about all these military men, and then all of a sudden it gets to the men of Issachar who came and David put in his legion, so to speak. And they were men not of war, but they were men that understood the times and they knew what Israel ought to do. So they were men that studied the times. They looked around and they took in as much information as they could. They didn't listen to one source of information and get tunnel vision with that, but they took in all the information that they could and they put it to scrutiny and they worked through it and they said, what's really going on here and what should Israel do? What ought we to do to move forward? And go ahead.
Well, I would say they processed that information through a biblical and a worldview that knows God and understands the world through His lens and who He's made us to be, what our place is in the world, what's going on in the world, the direction things ought to be moving, certainly are moving in God's history, and through Jesus we now see more clearly what God has done to reconcile humanity back to Himself.
Amen.
And so the church in this day, the worldwide church of Jesus, are the ones who God is calling specifically to be these agents of change, these ambassadors for reconciliation, because we understand, we ought to understand the world through this same biblical lens, and we're looking out and we're seeing what's going on and we're processing it and giving and voice to and providing a form of leadership. And that leadership is both sensitive and patient and gracious and understanding and
the same way we do in marriage.
Listen,
the same way we're commanded in marriage.
Serving, sacrificing, but also and you mourn with those who are mourning. You feel that pain because it is a broken world and people are hurting in it. But you see the problem for what it is, which is first and foremost the sin in our own heart that plagues us all. And it might express itself in different ways, in different forms, but really we all do the same kinds of things to each other. And so let's not be hypocrites, but let's recognize what our real problem is.
Take the plank out of your own eye before you go to take the plank out of your brother's.
And what we've pointed to in this conversation, but in previous ones, but we'll get to more going forward too, is that there's another enemy that's the common enemy of mankind, and Satan, who is also manipulating things. There's a spiritual reality that overlaps in a sense this physical one, and then there's a real enemy who has power and who actively, his main weapon is to deceive. And so he manipulates us and puts us at odds with one another. And so we need to see clearly and elevate our vision by the grace of God to see things as they really are and to be able to then provide good sound advice and so, and to be able to discern, hey, yeah, this is really a problem. What you're talking about, there's a real problem here, but I don't agree with these solutions. And and even being able to reject how it's being characterized. So we are acknowledging and accepting the reality of the problem, but we're rejecting the narrative that's being provided to us and forced upon us, and that so many people are just embracing because it's the only narrative being presented pretty much. So, oh, well, this is the problem. I'm the problem. I guess you're right. And then, what other solutions are we accepting, and will they actually provide a fix to the problem? And we're just saying no, they won't.
And it's not our pride that keeps us from diving into this narrative and doing what they tell us to do. And I felt that's what somebody accused me of. You're just too prideful to acknowledge it. And I go, no, I'm not too prideful. I want to acknowledge it because it's not good. It's not good for you that I acknowledge it. The same way in my marriage, it wouldn't be good for me to acknowledge or to something that my wife sees totally wrong to go, yeah, babe, that's right. That's not going to help us in the future.
You feel pressured to accept the narrative as it's given because there's a lot of peer pressure, and because people are saying, well, you're immoral if you don't accept this the way
which is part of the narrative.
Yeah, and right. And so we're saying, and it's actually not a pride issue. It is. There's a pride issue, but what is required is humility, actually, to reject the narrative and say, hey, no, what I'm saying is I humbly acknowledge that this is a problem, but I'm also suggesting and insisting that you see that, hey, this other stuff is part of the problem too.
Yeah.
And if this is the solution we're going after, then, man, it's not going to work. Yeah. And I'm going to stand on that. And if it comes down to it, I'm going to defend that because I believe that is right. And I believe that, my perspective, this perspective on it is actually the only one that's going to get us there. So I'm going to actively reject your false narrative, and I'm going to expose it graciously, humbly, if you'll let me, to help you see why it's incomplete and therefore wrong. And but be humble enough yourself to hear from me, and let's see
and come challenge me.
Yeah,
we're totally.